Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, a podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm an investigative journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are economists, scientists, politicians, academics, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, and ecological crises that we face today. And they reveal their solutions to mitigate the damage to our future. This is a critical time for our planet. It demands critical thinking. Click the subscribe button now and go to planetcritical.com to learn more. This week's guest is economic anthropologist Jason Hickel, and Jason joined me to discuss degrowth and ecosocialism. Now, what I absolutely loved about speaking with Jason is that he provides a framework for a future that doesn't turn us all into farmers, which is great to hear as somebody that doesn't know how to farm. He really lays out that there are models that we can implement and there are policies that we can implement that can not only bring our consumption within the planetary boundaries and stop the overshoot that we're currently facing, but increase quality of life, access to healthcare, access to education, and also lift the 60% of the world that are currently living in poverty into a lifestyle of human dignity. I joke about the farming thing, but I think this is so important because essentially he is saying that a post-carbon world not only provides hope for the future for, those of us living in the West, but it can be used to align all of the social justice and environmental and labor policies to create a better future for humankind globally, for the planet, for biodiversity, to combat these crises that we currently face. We get into the nitty-gritty of renewables and how viable they are, the policies and how to implement them. And we also discuss the power structures that are currently in place that are really trying to keep this discourse out of the mainstream. There is so much to learn in this episode. I really hope you enjoy it as much as I did. If you do, please share it far and wide. If you love the episode, do consider supporting Planet Critical on Patreon, where interview transcripts are available for patrons. The link is in the description box below, and a huge thank you to everyone who's already supporting the project. First of all, thank you so much for making time for me and for Planet Critical. It's a real honor to have you on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Good. Well, I hope to do your work justice. So you are kind of one of the leaders in degrowth. You've written a book about it, you've written a couple of books about it, and you're extremely sort of active on Twitter about the policies that need to be implemented, about the dangers of capitalism. And I read through a couple of your pieces last night and this morning. I haven't had a chance to read your book yet, by the way, and I do apologize for that. And I mean, I kind of want to start with, like, if you could give an introduction to degrowth for anyone that might not have heard it, and then we'll sort of go from there and swing into fossil fuels as quickly as possible.
Okay. Okay. So degrowth is it's a pretty straightforward idea. The idea basically is that is first to recognize that we live in an era of ecological crisis, driven by excessive levels of energy and resource use. And the reason that high levels of energy use are a problem is because it makes it more difficult for us to decarbonize the economy in time to stay under 1.5 degrees, right? And the reason the excess resource use is a problem is because it's driving all sorts of other ecological pressures, such as, deforestation and biodiversity collapse and et cetera, et cetera. Effectively, the other planetary boundaries, aside from climate change, are being affected by excess resource use. And the key thing to recognize is that rich countries are overwhelmingly responsible for driving this crisis, right? They have extremely high levels of per capita energy use, extremely high levels of per capita resource use, vastly in excess of what is required to meet human needs, even at a high standard, right?
Mm.
So effectively, in light of this, what degrowth calls for is for rich countries to actively scale down their use of the planet's energy and resources in order to bring the economy back into balance with the living world in a safe, just, and equitable way. And it's very straightforward, actually, in terms of practical application. Basically, in our existing economy, we assume that all sectors of the economy must grow every year, all the time, regardless of whether or not we actually need them to. And what degrowth scholarship simply points out is that we should have a more rational approach to thinking about economic production. So let's think about what sectors we actually need to expand or improve, things like renewable energy capacity or public transportation networks or public healthcare access, things like that. And then what sectors of the economy are clearly too big, destructive, socially less necessary, and should be scaled down, right? So things like production of SUVs and private jets and fast fashion, arms, the practice of planned obsolescence where products are built basically in a way that's designed to break down so that you have to buy new ones and increase product turnover and corporate profits and so on. Basically, there are huge chunks of the economy that are organized not around human need or around human well-being, but rather around maximizing corporate profits and corporate power and elite accumulation. And so the observation here is that with a discriminating approach to how the economy works, we can scale down excess production. And the power of that is that it dramatically reduces energy use, which is important because the less energy we use, the faster we can transition to renewables and decarbonize the economy to stay under 1.5 degrees. And scaling down production also obviously reduces resource use, which removes pressure from all other planetary boundaries and allows ecosystems to regenerate. So it's very powerful. And the exciting thing here is that we know from empirical research and modeling that we can do this while at the same time improving people's lives, right? Improving social indicators. So it's possible to improve social outcomes in rich countries while at the same time quite dramatically scaling down resource and energy use. We know that if we are to organize the economy around human needs and provisioning and livelihoods, rather than around elite accumulation, we can meet human needs at a very high standard with a fraction of the energy and resources that high-income nations presently use. So it's extremely exciting as a research field. It's extremely exciting in terms of the policy options and in terms of what can be achieved in terms of ecological objectives and regeneration.
Let's get into the renewables part of it, because obviously at the moment, the main call around the world is for economies or nations to green their economy and to switch to renewables. But of course, the problem with renewables is they require much more in terms of minerals and materials to build the stations necessary, like wind turbine plants and solar panels, etc., etc. And also the fact that they simply do not generate enough energy. They cannot compete with fossil fuels in terms of output. Like I think it was Nate Higgins that I had on the show that said 1 barrel of oil equates to the work of a single man over 4 years. And that's why we've seen this huge explosive growth in the economy since we kind of, found the dinosaur bones in the earth. That's why the economy is 1,000 times bigger than it was 500 years ago. So, I mean, my concern when I see how do I put this? The conversation about renewables is that very often the necessity of decreasing energy consumption is not pointed out at the same time, not obviously in degrowth scholars, but you're kind of seeing a lot of, at COP26, essentially the belief that's being peddled is that you can just switch to renewables and we can continue business as usual. How do we adequately bring energy consumption into the conversation politically and internationally without frightening people that they're essentially going to be plunged back into the dark ages? Because surely what we're going to see if we don't sort of dismantle capitalism is the global south being raped for their minerals and metals in the same way that they've been raped for their fossil fuels and for their forests for the past 100 years. Unless we start to, as you say, sort of restructure the economy as well. How do we push all those things forward at the same time so that it doesn't become just as harmful as it is today, but green?
Yeah, no, this is such an important question. And there's actually several issues that should be dealt with here. Of course, I think Nate is right that there's some significant questions about the extent to which our existing economy could be powered with the same kind of patterns of accumulation and expansion, et cetera, with renewable energy. But to me, this is actually a lesser interesting part of the story.
Okay.
So for me, the key issue here is that the more we grow the economy, we know that there's a close relationship between energy and economic growth, right? The more you grow the economy, the more energy you use. Now, this is a problem because as we pursue economic growth and grow energy use at the same time, this makes it more difficult for us to achieve decarbonization of the economy, right? Like it's more difficult to decarbonize a bigger energy system than it is to decarbonize a smaller one. And
Yeah.
so for rich countries to continue to pursue growth while at the same time trying to decarbonize, it makes the task more difficult, right? Like
Yeah.
it's like trying to shovel sand into a hole that keeps getting bigger, or to run down up escalator or something like that. Like it makes your task more difficult. And so in terms of the sheer speed that is required for decarbonization to stay within carbon budgets for 1.5 or 2 degrees, it's essential that rich nations reduce energy demand. And you know what? The thing is, this is recognized very widely in climate modeling. The IPCC reports themselves are very clear about this fact, right? If you start from the assumption that rich nations should continue to grow as usual, then the only way to square that assumption with the Paris Agreement is to bet on mass deployment of speculative negative emissions technologies to get us out of trouble. And more politicians are basically relying on that assumption to square this contradiction, right, between growth and decarbonization. So if you scale down your assumptions about what can be achieved with negative emissions technology, more in line with what scientists deem to be feasible and safe, then you're looking at the necessity of actively reducing energy demand in high income countries, and that's just kind of the fact we have to face up to. And right now, that's just not part of the discourse in rich nations. Now, crucially here, when we talk about reducing energy use, I'm not talking about like let's switch to LEDs, et cetera, right? Like clearly that is important and it does make a difference. But the vast majority of the energy that's used in our economy is not, household consumption issues. It's production. It's basically it's the capitalist production system, which just devours energy for extraction and production and transportation of material goods, processing them as waste, et cetera, et cetera. It's an energy sucking machine. And so the less of that unnecessary production we do, the less energy we use and the more quickly we can decarbonize. That's the first thing. Now, even if we assume that problem away, right, which is a big assumption, you're still left with another issue, which you alluded to, which is that renewable energy does not come out of thin air, right? Of course, the sun and the winds are low impact in and of themselves, clearly, but the materials required to capture and transform solar and wind power into usable energy for us is materially intensive. It requires an extraordinary amount of material extraction. Now, that's fine. Clearly, we have to transition to renewables as quickly as possible. But given the material impacts of this transition, it is vital to abandon the assumption that we should continue to increase energy use at the same time, because that's just going to increase material use, which is already having negative social and ecological effects around the world. Material use is the major driver of biodiversity collapse. And obviously, the supply chains in the global south under multinational corporations are deeply unjust and deeply destructive. Already the hunt for lithium is ecological disaster. So the key principle here is simply that on that front too, yes, we need renewable energy, but crucially, we also just need to consume less energy. And this is precisely the point that degrowth focuses on and elaborates.
I've had a couple of people, system scientists on the show, say that talking about phasing out fossil fuels is a little bit disingenuous and dangerous because of the requisite fossil fuels that we need in order to create a grid of renewable energy around the world. And I had Alice Friedemann say that even calling renewables renewable is misleading because obviously whilst sun and wind is renewable, the machines that we need in order to generate electricity from those natural processes require materials. And she says that we need to call them, therefore, rebuildables. And I noticed that I read one of your I read one of your articles. And I noticed that you quoted an a World Bank report that modeled the increase in material extraction that would be required to build enough solar and wind utilities up until 2050, which would be half of the world's energy. And then you presumed, okay, if we increased to 2100, et cetera, we would need, what was it, like a 1,000% increase in metals for energy storage, for example. Now, I skimmed through that report. And so I have a question for you, because I'm hoping that maybe you'll have the answer, because I couldn't find it. In that model, were they modeling the fact that those wind turbine plants and solar energy stations would need to be rebuilt every 20 years or not?
Oh, Rachel, that's a good question. I'm not actually sure. I'm not sure, and I know that the World Bank model is one among several models that have explored these questions more recently,
Mm.
and so I think that the World Bank one I think is from 2018. So we'd have to take a look at more recent models and see. But you raise an important point here, which is that there's a lot of energy and materials required in sort of continually regenerating the renewable grid, as it were. That has to be taken into account. So I'm not sure of the figures on that, unfortunately, but yeah, that's certainly an issue to pay attention to.
I'll tweet it out and see if anybody can get back to us on that, or maybe
Sounds
just
good.
read through the report with a fine tooth comb. Right, let's get into eco-socialism really, because I'm really interested in the work that you've done that is about social justice. And you write a lot about climate job guarantees and how about increasing quality of life, which is also therefore reducing precarity, which, despite how privileged we are in the West, is a huge problem for working classes and increasingly middle classes. So how could we restructure the economy in a way that would provide people with a purpose and with access to what they need through an pro-ecological economy?
Mm. Yeah, no, this is so important, and this is really kind of the crux of degrowth scholarship, actually, because
Mm,
obviously what degrowth is calling for is a planned reduction of excess energy and resource use. In other words, the parts of the economy that are not necessary for human flourishing, therefore to focus instead on kind of the human-centered economy instead, right? Now, and in this
yeah.
respect, it's fundamentally different from a recession, and I cannot emphasize this enough. We have different words for these things because they're fundamentally different
Mm,
phenomena, right? So a recession is what happens when a growth-addicted capitalist economy like our own fails to achieve sufficient growth, and basically things fall apart as a consequence. It's a very dangerous machine where if it doesn't get enough growth, things start to collapse, and it's extremely destructive. It ruins people's lives. Poverty rates shoot up, hunger goes up, homelessness goes up, inequality rockets, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a catastrophe, right?
mm,
Recognizing that, degrowth calls for a shift to a different kind of economy, one that can deliver high levels of human well-being without the need for additional growth, and indeed, while scaling down excess resource and energy use. How is that possible? The key principle here is this, right? One of the reasons that we presently cannot talk about scaling down unnecessary forms of production, even if we agree, like we could scale down commercial air travel, we could scale down SUVs or industrial beef or whatever it might be, we might be able to achieve consensus on that. And yet we'll still be worried about it because as you scale down that kind of production, what about jobs? People are going to lose their
yeah.
jobs, unemployment will rise, et cetera. So degrowth scholarship proposes a very simple solution to this, which actually has been proposed by progressive economists for more than 100 years, which is simply to shorten the working week
Wow.
and distribute necessary labor more evenly, right? So as our economy
Uh-huh.
requires less labor to produce the things that we actually need, then you distribute that necessary labor, like remaining necessary labor more evenly by shortening the working week. And as part of this, we can introduce something like a climate job guarantee. And I call for this simply because it's a way of mobilizing labor around the crucial collective projects that we need in order to transition to an ecological economy, right? So installing renewable energy capacity, retrofitting homes, regenerating ecosystems, et cetera, et cetera. A climate job guarantee would allow anyone who wants to
Mm,
train and participate in those collective projects with a dignified living wage, doing crucial, socially useful work. Um, and that's very powerful. And these two
mm,
policies together, this idea of a shorter working week and a climate job guarantee, would immediately end unemployment permanently. And that's important because that clears up the political logjam, right? It allows us to, like, once the question of employment and livelihoods is off the table, it allows us to have a conversation about what sectors of the economy we can scale down without worrying about how that might affect livelihoods and employment and so on, right?
Can I jump in here quickly and ask? Because obviously it was Henry Ford that introduced the 5-day working week because he figured out if people have more time off, then they're going to spend more money and, i.e., buy his cars. Um, What is the model between if we reduce the working week and then the impact that would have on consumption? Because surely that's
Yeah.
another thing where it has to be double pronged, right? Where you're already in the process of decarbonizing the economy and shifting the values of the economy rather than just giving people more time off essentially immediately.
Right. No, so of course, people only consume what is being produced, right? And this is actually
Right.
why I think it's important in the degrowth scholarship that there's been this a shift from traditional environmentalist thought, which focuses on consumption of individuals, right, to
Mm-hmm.
a more systemic analysis, which focuses on the production system. And so, by scaling
Mm-hmm.
down excess forms of production, socially less necessary forms of production, you deal with that problem already, right? And so,
Yeah.
and so that's really important. It's not like we are taking more time off in the existing economy where we're spending the same amount of money on the same kinds of
Mm.
products that are out there, right? There's a change.
Yeah.
We're no longer buying SUVs. We're no longer subject to the arbitrariness of planned obsolescence, right? Our products last longer, et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera. So what happens in this kind of situation is that the additional time is not deployed in consumption. It's expended in conviviality, in care, in relationships, in
Mm.
creativity, in learning, in maintenance, and so on. And what's interesting also is that we have really strong empirical evidence actually on this from economists like Juliet Schor, um, who point out that a shorter working week dramatically improves things like well-being, mental health outcomes, physical health outcomes, gender equality, while at the same time reducing emissions and also reducing consumption, which is
Mm.
remarkable. Like when people have more time, they actually, it turns out, even in the existing economy, consume less.
Wow.
And that's a remarkable finding. And the reason basically is because when we lead these kind of frenetic, work-oriented lives, we have very little time to say cook for our families or maintain something that could be fixed. Instead, we go for cheaper fixes like ordering food in or uh, uh, getting rid of the bookshelf and buying a new one, et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera.
Yeah.
And so some really interesting positive effects emerge from shortening the working week. So it's this powerful win-win policy that is quite central to degrowth thinking.
That is fascinating. Oh God, I'm having one of those moments which happens in every single interview, which is like, oh, it's already been modeled, it's already been figured out. Why aren't we implementing it? Why isn't this happening already? Jesus, if we can
Yeah.
do good for the planet and increase mental health and well-being, like we have win-win situations. What is going on? Why is it not in process? Oh, I mean,
Yes,
who
clearly.
who who are we up against?
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, this is interesting because I mean, there's several other degrowth policies that are key in this space, which I'd like to discuss, and then we can
Oh,
talk
go
about,
on. Oh yeah, go on.
basically why people are against it, or why
Mm,
elites are against it, effectively.
mm,
The other crucial one, in addition to a shorter working week and a climate job guarantee, is universal basic services, right? So the observation that degrowth scholarship makes is that by decommodifying the core social sector of the economy, right? Healthcare, education, obviously, but also housing, transportation, energy, water, internet, like the things that people need in order to live decent, dignified lives. By
mm-hmm.
decommodifying those things, you enable people to access the resources they need to live well without needing high levels of GDP in order to do so. Okay, so think about it. If you're living on $30,000 in the USA, then
Mm-hmm.
you're poor because you cannot afford medical care. You cannot afford to send your kids to university. There's no public transportation, and so you're probably having to buy a car and commute, et cetera, right? If
Mm-hmm.
you're living on that same amount of money in a place where healthcare, housing, education, transit are decommodified, then your welfare purchasing power is much higher. And so
Mm-hmm.
you can improve people's lives without growth simply by decommodifying the core social goods that people need, right?
Right.
Thereby improving the welfare purchasing power of existing income. And this is extremely powerful. And furthermore, we know uh, that when it comes to the determinants of social well-being and social indicators, what matters is not GDP as such, but rather people's access to these core social goods. That is the main determinant of human well-being, and that's what we should focus our economies on. And so what this all amounts to is kind of this de-enclosure of the commons, if you will. So if you look at the history of capitalism, it's all organized around enclosing the commons, producing an artificial scarcity of access to employment and livelihoods and resources, so that people have no choice but to work in a competitive economy, producing value and profits for capital in order to eke by, right? And that's basically the engine of perpetual expansion and accumulation. If you decommodify that core economy and take the question of employment off the table, then suddenly you're liberated from that constant pressure to produce and expand solely for the sake of capital accumulation. And that's an extremely powerful antidote to the irrational, headlong rush of our existing economy toward destruction. So what's exciting is that these policies, a shorter working week, climate job guarantee, universal basic services, living wages, etc., are all extremely popular everywhere that they've been polled in high-income countries. People want these things, strong majorities, 70+%. And that's interesting. So like these core degrowth policies are wildly popular. The obstacle to achieving a kind of transition to ecosocialism is not ordinary people, contrary to the dominant discourse of, oh, no one's going to accept this. Rather, it is simply the elites who benefit so prodigiously from the existing structure of the economy will fight us with everything they have, right? And the key weapon in their arsenal is this claim they peddle every day, which is that economic growth is necessary for human well-being, right? We know that's not true. We know that we can have an economy that delivers human well-being without growth, and it's essential to attack that ideology.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a bizarre claim. You would think that they would come up with a better claim, like a better slogan, because it's so untrue. If you look at, I think you quoted the well-being or the quality of life in Costa Rica, Cuba, these kinds of places. I mean, Cuba's a great one because it's communist. So there's no impetus on growth, and yet they are just as well, if not better off, than the United States, which is the most growth dominant and obsessed nation, arguably, in the world. So, I mean, you would think that they would have come up with something a little bit more imaginative and inventive by now. And yet I think it shows the power that they have in the discourse to keep peddling out utter falsities and to not be challenged. And that just one challenge doesn't sort of shatter their whole illusion immediately.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Yeah, so you can point to Costa Rica and Cuba and so on. But if you want to stay closer to home, then you can also look at countries like Spain, right? So if you look at the US versus Spain, just for an example, the US, of course, one of the richest countries in the world, GDP per capita of $65,000. Compare that to Spain. Spain has 55% less GDP per capita, right? So less than half, no? And yet it outperforms the US on every key social indicator with a life expectancy that is more than 5 years longer, right? One of the highest in the world. So this is extraordinary. How is it possible that that this could be achieved? The answer is quite simple. Because Spain has a universal healthcare system, is less commodified than the USA, and so people have access to the things they need to live decent lives. And income is shared more fairly. So it's quite straightforward, actually. The recipe is straightforward, and Spain is not an outlier. There are 40 countries that outperform the USA with significantly less GDP per capita, and that should be a strong reminder to us of what is possible. So yeah, that's crucial. But look, I think that the reason that the growth narrative is so powerful is simply because of the framing, right? Like growth just sounds so good. It sounds so natural. It sounds like, children grow, plants grow, we grow in knowledge and maturity, et cetera, et cetera. And so by tapping into that into that framing, into that narrative, then they're able to sell anything that generates growth as good, right? And they will stand at the podium every day and defend whatever project is going on the grounds that it produces growth. And they will assume that all of us will buy into the idea that growth will always be good for us, right? And
Hmm.
so, yeah, so I mean, look, this is an ideological terrain ultimately, and it's important to be able to challenge that core ideological claim. And that's effectively what degrowth does.
Can we talk a little bit more about maybe the historical ideology of it? Because obviously the first word that comes to mind when discussing these disastrous policies of constant growth and expansion is capitalism. And yet, arguably, we do have a long history of, yes, collaboration, but also expansion and growth. So, what is it in our social organization that engenders systems such as capitalism to become dominant? And what can we do about it to minimize that as we look to degrow and decarbonize the economy?
Yeah, so I think that the key thing for most people to understand is to have a clear idea of what capitalism actually is, right?
Mm,
Uh, Most people will say, oh, when they hear capitalism, they think, oh, that is a system of markets and trade, maybe even businesses, etc. And that all sounds innocent enough on the face of it. What could possibly be wrong with markets and trade? But in reality, markets and trade, of course, existed for thousands of years before
yeah,
capitalism, right? Capitalism is only 500 years old.
yeah,
So what distinguishes capitalism from all other economic systems is that it is a system that is organized and dependent on perpetual expansion. And the
right,
point of perpetual expansion is not in order to meet some concrete human need or use value, right? But rather to generate and accumulate profit, okay? Or what
right,
Marx called exchange value.
yeah,
I mean, effectively, profit emerges from exchange value transactions.
yeah,
So in order to do that, in order to have a perpetually increasing accumulation of profits and a perpetual expansion of this exchange value system, the only way to do this is to cheapen labor and
yeah,
nature
yeah,
as much as possible, to depress the
yeah,
prices of labor and nature. And so it should come as no surprise that a system that is organized around perpetually depressing the prices and cheapening labor and nature generates ecological crises and inequality, right? It is literally
yeah,
baked into our system. So when left to
yeah.
its own devices, that will always be the result. Um, and that's effectively I mean, we're in the throes of this crisis right now with extraordinary levels of global inequality and an ecological crisis
Mhm.
unfolding around us. And we have to be able to point to the fundamental driver of this, which is the capitalist economy. And it means we have to be able to imagine our way to a post-capitalist economy, one
Mhm.
that is, again, I mean, very simply, focused on meeting human needs within planetary boundaries,
Mhm.
rather than focused on, perpetual expansion and accumulation for the sake of profits. It's quite simple.
It seems to me that one of the, and we can go back and discuss sort of the capitalists that are blocking the degrowth progress. But it seems to me one of the most insidious ways in which they're managing that is by talking about how to make an economy green without talking about limiting growth. And in that green economy, we are essentially seeing the commodification of climate change, which is shocking, I think, to anybody with half a mind. Shell, for example, is peddling out its nature-based solutions and talking about buying up pieces of rainforest around the world in order to protect it, which most people aren't aware of. But that means if a forest is going to be protected by a multinational corporation, it means that no indigenous people can be on that land already, because therefore it's not a credit to the green economy. So there's massive fears amongst the indigenous communities all around the world that this is going to be used as another land grab. What other ways are you seeing this push to a green economy take away from the degrowth method or system?
There's so many ways this manifests. I mean, again, let's talk
Mm.
briefly about negative emissions.
Yeah,
Right. This is the savior
it's mad.
technology. Yeah, this is the savior technology
Mm.
that everyone's is hoping will sort of yank us out of trouble just in time.
Yeah.
And if you look at what is proposed, it's extraordinary, actually. So the main negative emissions technology is called BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. The idea here is that we will grow massive biofuel plantations, 3 times the size of India. And we will
Where?
then, and these biofuel plantations will suck carbon out of the atmosphere as the plants grow. We'll harvest them for energy stations. We'll burn them for power, and then we'll capture the carbon that comes out of the stacks effectively and store it underground. Right? Voila, you have a negative emissions technology.
Uh,
Now, what's interesting is this main question. I mean, there's several problems here. One, of course, is that this technology has never been scaled. There's no evidence that it is viable at scale. It relies on massive monoculture plantations, which will drive further biodiversity collapse, further deforestation, will take away from food crops, et cetera, et cetera. But let me point to this issue, which is that where is that land going to come from?
Yeah.
I guarantee you it's not going to come from southern England. It's not going to come from Belgium. No, this is land that is going to be appropriated from the landmass of the global south. Already, that is the assumption in the existing models, right? And this is extraordinary. The idea is that there will be an imperial appropriation of land from the global south for the sake of maintaining the North's energy privilege. Again, levels of per capita energy that are wildly in excess of what is required to meet human needs. And this is a totally untenable, deeply morally problematic assumption, right? So, and yet it is the main assumption right now. And most people are not aware of this. And it's just important that we be able to point that out.
Where is it being discussed? In which rooms, with which people?
Well, so for example, if you pay attention to John Kerry's discourse, right? He showed up in London a few months ago after Biden's inauguration, and he was asked about about the U.S. climate plan, because they have these big ambitious pledges to bring emissions down to zero by some particular date in the middle of the century, et cetera. And he was very candid. And on TV, he said, look, in response to an interviewer who asked him, how do you plan to do that? He said, look, the majority of these emissions reductions will come from technology that does not yet exist. And this was a very candid acknowledgement of the fact that they don't have a plan for bringing emissions down as fast as they need to go. They are relying on literally fairy tale technology that does not exist, and which, if implemented, would be quite destructive. Now, this is important because if for whatever reason that technology fails to materialize in the way and to the scale expected, then we are stuck in a hothouse trajectory from which it will be impossible to escape, right? Once we overshoot these climate budgets, there's no pulling that back down on civilizational timescales. So we're in trouble for a very long time. And this is why climate scientists routinely say this is an extremely risky gamble with the future of humanity and with all of life on Earth, and should not be tolerated. Effectively, all of it is a ruse to avoid the hard question, which is that we have to reduce emissions very, very quickly in rich countries, reaching zero by around 2030 or 2035, right? Nobody is presently planning for that kind of decarbonization. And the only way to achieve decarbonization with that kind of speed is with degrowth. And it's crucial that we start having that conversation. Otherwise, we'll be stuck in this kind of fairy tale land until it's just too late.
There seems to be just pure fantasy around the mainstream discourse, which is either that, technology is going to save us, techno-optimism, or that we are going to plunge back into the dark ages, which Boris Johnson said on television when he was in Rome just before COP26. Do you have figures on how we could reduce emissions and energy consumption to still live with dignity that will provide people with perhaps a sense of ease or comfort that they are not going to, I don't know, have to learn to farm in a decade's time, that there is a happy medium?
Yeah, definitely. This is really important. I mean, immediately when you propose let's reduce energy, people will say, "Oh, you're basically asking us to go back to the caves, etc." This is utterly ridiculous. And again, the key observation here is that most of the excess energy that is used in the economy is used for the sake of corporate expansion and elite accumulation, right? So
Mm.
we need to focus on cutting that energy, and so that we can focus energy on what's needed for human well-being and livelihoods and flourishing. Okay. Now, importantly, we have strong empirical evidence on this. Recent research by Julia Steinberger, professor at, she was at Leeds when she did this research with her team there. She's a lead author of the IPCC. Her team found that we can provide energy sufficient to meet human needs at a high standard for a global population of 10 billion people, so much more than we presently have,
Wow.
with 60% less energy than the world economy presently uses. So this is a scenario where you eradicate energy poverty permanently around the world, where everyone has access to high quality healthcare, education, housing, heating, cooling, refrigeration, transportation, et cetera, with a fraction of the energy that we presently use, right? This is the power of a shift towards an economy that provisions for human needs rather than diverting energy to capital accumulation. So it's very exciting what can be achieved, actually, with such a shift, and should not inspire fear at all. Rather, it's
Yeah.
quite clear that we can improve. Again, most people would be better off in such a scenario. The people that will lose out are elites who enjoy such extraordinary energy privilege right now. They're clearly
Yeah.
going to have to have quite fundamental changes to the way that they live in the world.
Yeah.
And that's okay, right? We don't want to live in a world with such extraordinary inequality. It is corrosive and destructive for all sorts of reasons anyways.
That's amazing. So essentially, you're saying that we could maintain in fact, we could have a better quality of life with people still, and not everybody having to farm. Like people would still be able to have access to food without having to grow it in their new backyard, which is, I don't know, the nearest forest that they found and hunkered down in.
Yes.
But at the same time, in nations that are typically crippled by poverty and inequality, they would, for the first time, have access to those same human dignities as well.
Yes, that's right. Exactly.
Good God.
So it really gives you a sense for me, what I take from this kind of research is simply that that the existing economy is extremely wasteful in its use of energy. So little is actually devoted to meeting human needs. I mean, we live in a world, right, where something like 60% of the world's population cannot meet basic human needs. I mean, this is wild. This is the result of 500 years of capitalism, where we've had extraordinary growth, an extraordinarily productive economy, and yet more than half of the world's population lives in conditions of poverty. It's wild.
Yeah.
And it's not because there's not enough. It's because what there is appropriated at the top. And so this is ultimately the pattern of distribution that we must challenge, ultimately. Again, this is core to degrowth scholarship. It's basically a call for energy justice, for resource justice.
That's fantastic. I've said a couple of times on the show that I think that the climate crisis is a marketing problem because of this fantasy of either, technology is going to save us or we're going to slide back into the dark ages. Not enough is being discussed in mainstream discourse. Of course, this is a whole field and you and your colleagues are working on this day in, day out. But people don't recognize that reductions and a social transformation could inherently be beneficial for them. And I wonder if it is because of that, the 500 years of capitalist ideology, which essentially, growth is essentially like, it's the American dream, isn't it? It says to each individual, like, you might be lucky. You might be the one that gets everything that you want. And I think that may be, I don't know, I've not read any data on this, but that may be why so many sort of, your laymen of the world, myself included, why we are prone to hang on to the idea of growth, not just because change is uncomfortable. I hate when people say that because all humanity does all the time is change, but because it's that last vestige of individuality upon which we have built our Western culture, and shifting to something more social. That's the difficult change in which maybe, I don't know, maybe people feel like they will disappear. Getting a bit philosophical here now. I do apologize.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that's quite possible. I think also that it's also possible that people on some level recognize the extent to which dependencies on growth that permeate our existing economy do make them vulnerable, right? In the sense of, like, people are aware that if the economy stops growing, then unemployment goes up, and they don't want to be stuck in that kind of situation. Which is why you get labor unions, for example, which will line up with capital, calling for more growth because they see this as the only way to achieve decent employment and decent wages and so on, right?
Oh, that's
And
interesting.
that's why it's so important to point out that growth is not necessary to achieve those objectives. We can achieve those objectives right now by shortening the working week, introducing living wage policy, distributing income more fairly, and establishing universal basic services. Those are the things that actually matter, right? So we have to, for too long, we've just bought this narrative that we must kind of align with capital's call for growth for our own good somehow, even though in opinion polls, people routinely say that they prioritize human well-being and ecological stability over growth, or even at the expense of growth. If any other trajectory threatens their livelihoods, they will turn against it for good reason. And this is why it's so important to secure the question of livelihoods. This is why a just transition has to be at the very core of what we're talking about here. And this brings me to a point that I want to raise, which is that people will often ask me, will there be enough income in a degrowth scenario to meet everyone's needs? And the answer to that is yes, literally by definition. And this is quite an exciting point. So what people should understand is that income is simply the obverse of all of the prices in the economy, okay? So it's literally an accounting identity. So GDP as income is simply the obverse of the total prices that are of the products produced in the economy, okay?
Right.
Now, what that means is that there's always exactly enough money, exactly enough income to buy the things that the economy produces. If we were to scale down sectors of the economy that we all agree we do not need, again, let's say SUVs and private jets, okay? You scale that down, there will still, by definition, be exactly as much income as is necessary to buy all of the other things the economy does produce and which we do need, right? And so there's never a shortage of income by definition.
Of course.
The only question is, how is the income distributed, right?
Yeah.
As long as the income is distributed fairly, then everybody will have access to the purchasing power they need to buy everything that they require, literally by definition. And so this idea that we will somehow be poorer in a degrowth scenario is precisely the fallacy, right? As long as you can imagine an economy that has public transportation instead of SUVs, then you're imagining a degrowth economy, right? Where you can access your need for transit without the need for the income required to buy SUVs on a population level. So it's quite encouraging, really. It's quite liberating to think of the economy that way. What actually matters is what we are producing, whether those things meet human needs, and whether people have access to those things. That's it.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm sold. So what's next? What do we do? I mean, who are the politicians that are talking about this? Who can we look to? Who should we be voting in? Should we be calling for referendums? Like, how do we actually enact this? Because obviously there are huge power structures in place that are trying to stop it.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's actually there's quite a lot of interest in this among certain progressive political factions in Europe and even a little bit in the United States. So that's exciting. I mean, clearly it's not mainstream in political circles, and as a result, it's important that we have. I mean, crucially, what's going to be required here is building the social movements necessary to force political incumbents to change course or to unseat them and replace them with the kinds of political formations that we require, right? Now, how do we get there? This is going to require more than the environmentalist movements alone, okay? So degrowth thinking is kind of taken off in the environmentalist movement. But here's the thing, is that movement is not strong enough. It may be strong enough to change discourse about climate, for example, which it has successfully done over the past couple of years. But while they can shut down bridges in central London, they cannot mobilize the kind of political power that's necessary to force politicians to change course on fundamental policy measures
Hmm.
or to unseat incumbents, right? The only way to do that is to build alliances with the labor movements
Hmm.
and with working class formations. And this is what, I mean, this is my message to every environmentalist or climate activist, is that is the crucial step for 2022, 2023, and going forward this decade. Without that kind of alliance between environmentalists and labor, there's just no way that the movement will be strong enough to win the transition we need. And that kind of alliance will not happen on its own. It requires door-to-door organizing. It requires
Hmm.
building solidarities. It requires hard conversations. It requires also a fundamental shift in the labor movements away from their existing growthism, as I described before,
Yeah.
towards core eco-social demands. And with that in place, you get the environmentalist movements backing the demands of the labor movement, and the labor movement backing the demands of the environmentalist movement, and you win. That's the recipe, I think, and that's what we'll need to pursue in the coming years.
Good luck. I mean, like, I'm on board. I think that it sounds obvious when you say it, but obviously the environmentalist movement comes under a lot of flack for its middle classism. And part of
Yes,
that, I think, is, comparing sort of the global precarity of ecological breakdown with the individual precarity of the working classes with laborers
yes,
who,
yes,
don't have time typically, or security to think about these things. So yeah,
totally.
as you said, there's going to have to be a whole other language kind of construed in order to be able to meet each other halfway and recognize that the goals are the same, and
Totally.
we can meet them together.
Yeah, no,
But
absolutely. I mean, look, one of the reasons that's, I mean, it's true, the environmentalist movement totally alienates working class people.
yeah,
And one of the reasons is because they have this discourse around consumption, around individual behavior, and so on.
yeah,
And there's just no way that working class communities can relate to that. They're trying to make
mm,
ends meet, right? I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
a huge proportion of the population in the US and the UK literally live in poverty. So a
Hmm.
discourse
Hmm.
on consuming less is not going to fly with them. What we need is, and this is what degrowth brings to the table, is a direct attack on the production system, right? We have a production system that's organized around elite accumulation, and that's what we need to change. That's the system that's driving both inequality, impoverishment, and ecological breakdown. And we need all forces on board to change that. And I think that's the kind of narrative that the environmentalist movement needs to shift to, or otherwise,
Hmm.
honestly, risk irrelevance. If justice
Yeah.
is not part of their conversation, then we lose. It's as simple as that.
Is the social justice movement interested in degrowth? It would seem like a no-brainer, right?
Yeah, I think so. And increasingly, this is. I mean, you'll see this discourse in DM25, also in Democratic Socialists of America, and so on. So that's very exciting. Crucially, also, I should mention, and this is just so important, is that
Hmm.
degrowth has a strong anti-imperialist orientation, right?
Yeah.
In fact, degrowth thinking emerges from the anti-colonial movement in the global South in the 1950s and 60s, where they
Hmm.
recognized that growthism in the global North was a major driver of immiseration and appropriation in the global South, and so the demand for degrowth has always been on the lips of social movements in the global South. And you can see this, for example, in the People's Agreement of Cochabamba, which I encourage your listeners to read. So here again, I think that it's crucial that we build these transnational alliances as well, uniting with social movements in the global South that have been calling for this kind of shift as part of a broader demand for decolonization.
Yeah.
So these are the sort of constellations and alliances that need to emerge.
I think it's really interesting because the fracturing of the left is, I think, one of the main reasons that very little progress is being made on the ground. Because there seems to be like the agendas put on the table seem so disparate that people can't meet together to
Mm,
recognize that the goals are the same.
yes.
Um, so I think it's fascinating that for one, that this kind of research or this kind of discourse, as you say, started in the 50s and 60s, and that should be a warning to everybody at the power structures in play trying to keep this discourse out of the mainstream and
Mm,
to block awareness. Even, I just realized the other day that Limits to Growth, the book was published in the 70s. And it's like,
That's right,
it's half a
72.
century later,
Yeah,
it should be self-evident by now. But I think anything like the left needs to unify, and the left needs a good marketing strategy, and to bring the environmentalist movement, the social justice movement, climate reparations, labor, all of that together. I mean, that would seem to me as the quickest way to dismantle the system of elite power, because I mean, ultimately, we are the majority. And it is mad that we
that's
are the
right.
majority, and we are so terribly squeezed by such a small percentage of the population.
It's extraordinary, actually, right? And
Mm,
I think you're absolutely right. Like the key is to recognize that all forms of oppression and exploitation are connected,
yeah,
and that should be the basis of our organizing. And realizing that is extremely powerful.
yeah. What a fantastic note to end on. Jason, my final question for you then would be, who would you like to platform?
So there's three people I'd recommend. One of whom I mentioned actually in our discussion, which is Professor Julia Steinberger.
Yep.
If you haven't had her yet, and
If Julia, I've been trying to get you for a while. I think you're the third person to platform her. But last time I spoke to her, she said she was under magma, and I believe her. So,
oh gosh, yeah. Um, Another person is Vandana Shiva, who has been a key proponent of many of these ideas um, from her work in India.
Mhm.
I would also recommend Yorgos Kallis, who was the person who introduced degrowth scholarship to the English-speaking world,
Oh, fab.
and he's a colleague of mine. And then also Max Eil, who is a degrowth fellow traveler and who brings a really powerful kind of anti-imperialist perspective to his work on social and ecological justice and degrowth. So I've listed four now, not three. So
Fantastic.
I hope you're able to find at least one of them.
Brilliant. Jason, thank you so much for your time. This was absolutely fascinating and crucial. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks, Rachel.
If you want to learn more about Jason's work and get access to his books, I put the link to his website in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to this channel and share the episode if you enjoyed it. If you loved it, support Planet Critical on Patreon. Interview transcripts are available for patrons. The link is in the description box below. A huge thank you to the Planet Critical supporters. This work just wouldn't be possible without you. Thank you all for listening. See you next week.